Merhaba ve günaydın. Hi and welcome to everybody. Good morning. In order to understand the hopes for the future, one has to have a sense of how the past intersects the present, since together they lead to the future. So I'll start from an odd place, February 27th, 1933, a date which will be familiar to some of you. It's the date when the Berlin Reichstag was burned to the ground by the Nazi Party that, because of its control of the media, managed to facilitate the conviction that it had been the communists who had burned down the Reichstag and provided Mr. Hitler with the excuse for rounding up communists and putting them in places that were called concentration camps because they had not actually technically broken any laws, so they couldn't be thrown into prison. But a new idea of how to concentrate, and later on that word would be enhanced by the idea that those placed in concentration camps were placed there for their own protection, was born, and so proceeded. On September 15th, 1935, in Nuremberg, a series of race laws were passed, which isolated in a very specific way the group that had started to become the group of Hitler's primary focus, the Jews. On November 10th, 1938, Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, was the first time when across Germany active violence was undertaken against Jews, Jewish communities, their synagogues, their homes, their shops, and the like. And the same year marked the Nazi arrival, the German arrival, into Austria in what's called the Anschluss, which was followed rather quickly by a procedure that required anyone with a Jewish connection of one sort or another to provide property census forms whereby the regime could decide what to plunder from whom over the course of what they hoped would be many years. Also, in March 1933, to repeat, concentration camps began. Also, by September 1939, when the German armies marched into Poland, they decided for the first time that those, to use their terminology, who were not worthy of living would be put to death. And that set in motion the whole idea of a euthanasia process that led to the further evolution of concentration camps, of which there were several thousand, by 1941 into a series of 6 extermination camps. So what had become incarceration became the basis for extermination. I bring this up because among the more stunning emulations and yet contrasts with these activities led by Mr. Hitler are those led by Mr. Erdogan in Turkey many generations later. It was the beginning of his third term, however, not his first. In 2011, when Mr. Erdogan pushed for a Turkish-style presidency, as he called it, that would essentially eviscerate the legislative branch of Turkey's government and change the executive branch so that everything would revert to the presidency and the president would have essentially all power. The parliament would have none, and the prime minister would cease functionally to exist. And at that time, he asked of Fethullah Gulen, who for the previous 8 years was not, as you know, contrary to myth, an ally, but had supported Erdogan because of his conviction that, like Gulen, Erdogan was in favor of a democratic mode of government and saw democracy and Islam as compatible bedmates. This remains, of course, Mr. Gulen's conviction. It turns out it was not Erdogan's conviction at all. He would be saying somewhere shortly thereafter that democracy is like a train. You've got to know when to get off. And clearly he had decided by 2011, the beginning of his third term, that it was time to get off. So the relationship between him and Gulen at that point, of course, began to go a bit sour. 2 years later, as you have heard, in December 2013, there was an investigation into the rampant corruption committed not only by his government, but personally by his family, conversations overheard between Erdogan and his son regarding where to stash the millions that they obviously couldn't keep in the bank because that's exposed. Do we put it in shoebox under the bed? There's still 30 million, Dad. I don't know what to do with it. What should I do with it? And what is an interesting turnabout is that the outcome of the corruption scandal was that Mr. Erdogan, of course, turned on Gulen and the Hizmet movement to suggest that they were actually trying to get him, that it was somehow their setup, that somehow they were in control, that they were trying to put him behind bars inappropriately. As time moved on, by 2014, Erdogan had taken control almost entirely of the judiciary, replacing judges who didn't agree with him, judges who might be objective, with those who would and who would not be, would agree with him and would not be objective, which meant that the third branch of government, with the legislative and the executive, were falling very clearly under his control into his hands. Civil society fell very quickly thereafter. In 2015, he began a rampant overrun of business and taking from those whom he wanted to take from anything he chose to take, and making it impossible, increasingly impossible, for individuals who didn't agree with him to live lives the way they might have. By 2016, we'll come to this in a moment, of course, the military fell under his control. Intelligence fell under his control. The diplomatic corps fell under his control. Everything was interestingly focused on and designed, aside from having as its purpose for his total power, having as its purpose an amazingly obsessive focus on Hizmet, anything that could immobilize or discredit Hizmet. Echoes of what Mr. Hitler had tried with the communists and then with the Jews, and I'll come back to that point yet again, had tried 80 years earlier. By 2016, 90% of the media were under the control of Mr. Erdogan. 250 national and social TV channels were closed. Over 1,000 radio stations were closed. I'm repeating what you've heard earlier, just in case you didn't hear it the first time. 30 newspapers, 300 news websites, over 3,000 educational institutions from primary schools to universities were being closed, all in the course of that. And one juicy little symptom of the handling of the media is that there were no less than 20 different times when the report was made unequivocally that Mr. Gulen had died and that his family was making funeral arrangements for him. He did not, and he has not, and he shall not yet. So the coup, as it has been called, of July 16th was the culmination of an effort that really, in retrospect, had begun in 2011, picked up pace in 2013, and moved quickly over the following 3 years to arrive at a point where Mr. Erdogan could take complete power. A coup in a country which has a tradition of coups in the 20th century. Every 10 years, we Turks run another coup just to change government, just to show that we still remember how to do it. And yet, no one apparently knew how to do that coup in 2016. There was no leadership, was there? They didn't round up the leaders. They didn't round up Erdogan in the middle of the night, did they? They didn't do it in the middle of the night. Rush hour on the bridge? Are you kidding me? And lo and behold, Mr. Erdogan shows up on that bridge, cell phone in hand, not only to call his own troops to defend the government and to defend the country from these salacious, seditious Hizmeti, but he already has a list of all of the guilty, hundreds of names already there on the list. Somehow, magically, he came up with that list even before events had taken place. The Brits overheard him saying, "I don't care what happens as long as Hizmet gets blamed." So Gulen had reached the apogee of his stature as Erdogan's go-to boogeyman for anything and everything that could go wrong. Hizmet as a combination of what the Jews and the communists had been at a certain point in Hitler's regime, and after the coup, which was not failed but fake, by late April 2017, there were nearly 100,000, I'll be more precise, 98,542 people associated with Hizmet who had been interviewed, tortured, and of those at that time, about 45,524 who had been arrested, 134,194 individuals had been removed from their jobs in any kind of public position, and of course their livelihoods completely removed. You heard even more statistics from Sophia earlier. And the effectiveness of his apprehension of all of the media was very visible within a year when, in the New Yorker magazine, a high-end publication in the United States, a high-end journalist with great credentials wrote an article about Gulen which could have been written by Erdogan himself. Everything it said was negative, and everything it said evinced absolutely no effort on the part of the journalist to do any kind of research other than what was provided for him and to him by the government of Turkey. The obvious contrast between Hitler and Erdogan is that Hitler burnt the Reichstag to begin his rise to power. Erdogan created a fake coup to culminate his rise to power, to cover his massive corruption, not just the 2013 corruption scandal, but you already heard in passing the building codes that had been completely abrogated, the unfortunate tragic consequences of which we are now aware of, with 41,000 people dead and more going to end up counted among the dead. Complete control, his need for complete control, his need for total power, massive ego. That's difficult if you have an ethical opponent who is calling you on the carpet for this. Scapegoating needed for all the troubles that Turkey has had under his regime, from the economy to natural disasters. The image that I imagine he sees, Mr. Erdogan does every time he looks in the mirror, if you're familiar with the story of Snow White, when the wicked stepmother looks in the mirror, and every time it has said, "You're the most beautiful in the land," and one time suddenly the mirror says, "Oh no, Snow White is the most beautiful." The wicked stepmother has to get rid of Snow White. Mr. Erdogan has to get rid of Gulen, because every time he looks in the mirror, he sees the fake pious Muslim staring back at him, and behind it he can see the image of that calm, quiet, humble, pious Muslim by the name of Fethullah Gulen, Hoca Efendi, staring back at him. His fear of Gulen's revelations, back when he was mayor and Gulen and he were still associates. His political life was on the edge because he was going to a meeting that would endanger him. And Gulen, through his network, knew of it and told him. He fears, 20 years later, that Gulen will reveal this. He won't. Gulen wouldn't even tell me what it was. He would not. But of course, Erdogan would, so he assumes that Gulen would. All of these are part of his relationship, his mal-relationship with Gulen and the Hizmet movement. Like Hitler, Erdogan redefined and drew support from ethno-nationalism, pure Germans, pure Turks. Erdogan, pure political Islam, by the way. Gulen, pure civil Islam, as you know. After the coup, schools from Nigeria to Pakistan closed by intimidation or other means, feuds with his former allies, with the members of countries in the Middle East, with the EU, with the United States, and also a brain drain, Germany, Austria, their allies, suffered because of Hitler. Freud left, Schrödinger left, Elias Canetti left, Peter Lorre left, Fritz Lang left, all of these individuals, Nobel laureates, future Oscar winners. So the question is, for Turkey, what will happen? All the talent has oozed out, from engineering to education, from mathematics to visual arts to sports. Enes Kanter, the NBA basketball player. Hitler was suicidal for Germany. Erdogan seems to be suicidal for Turkey. Germany had been a cultural, intellectual, socioeconomic leader. Turkey was a leader, a model within the region and within the East-West world connection. And of course, we already see what has happened. 2023, the earthquake, which led to 5,000 Syrian deaths, has led to 37,000 Turkish deaths, 36,000 Turkish deaths, because of the abrogation of those building codes, and because aid was so slow to get to the sites which needed aids because of his own agenda. Hizmet has flourished. In Georgia, in Tbilisi, there are Hizmeti who are flourishing. In Europe, in England, in Canada, in Australia, in the United States, Hizmet weaves its threads into the fabric of the countries and places where it takes residence, because it functions as an intrinsically altruistic kind of organization, as we've also just heard. Hoca Efendi has continued to step back with respect to direct guidance. He gives advice, he gives blessings, but all of the various networks within the network of Hizmet operate with increasing autonomy. Autonomy of the individual branches under different organizational names, I visited in eastern Pennsylvania in November and saw that in action because there were leaders meeting there, and they met with Hoca Efendi just to get his blessing, but not to ask even his advice, because they know at this point he will say to them, you know better than I. You're out there on the ground, I'm in here. More women are at the front. That was my gripe with Hizmet 10 years ago. Women in the kitchen, men in the living room. There are women in the living room now as well. Younger people are participating with increasing vigor. I saw that at a retreat in December of 2016. I saw it just last week, an extraordinary conference in Houston of 400 college kids from across the Hizmet world, and the energy is palpable. I saw it when I last visited Georgia, in those who had come over the border having spent a year in hiding before they could, and who were already finding their way within Georgia itself. Because Hizmet attracts and affects diverse groups, diverse individuals. It started out as a Muslim Turkish movement. It's an international movement that attracts people from all faiths and all forms of nationality and ethnicity. It doesn't practice the violence that Erdogan hoped it would in response to him. It practices sabr, it practices patience, it practices readiness to forgiveness. Erdogan's regime will perish when he does, and Turkey's recovery from his depredations will be slow and difficult. The Hizmet movement will outlive Fethullah Gulen, inspired by his teaching, his preaching, his legacy of commitment to altruistic Hizmet, service, hoşgörü, seeing the world from inside someone else's eyes. He has effectively prepared the ground for the efflorescence of the democratically shaped structures and procedures which define the movement, which, as we know, is properly called Hizmet, although was inspired by Fethullah Gulen. Thank you all so very much.